Hey, Interpersonal, Mrs. Roth here, and I'm going to walk you through part 1 of Chapter 4 notes. All right, so Chapter 4 is all about intercultural communication. And really what that means is communicating between a whole bunch of different cultures. So as you're looking at Chapter 4, you can think about who do you tend to communicate and how often do you communicate with people who are really different than you or have a different culture than you? And what is culture anyway, right? So those are a couple of the things that we'll be thinking about as we go through Chapter 4 notes. The first thing is that you want to make sure you've got your notes guide and that you've got it in Notability or printed off so you can fill in the notes as we go here, okay? So the first question says define culture, and here's the definition of culture for you. Culture is the specialized lifestyle of a group of people passed on from one generation to the next. Specialized lifestyle of a group of people passed from one generation to the next. So a couple interesting points in this definition. One, lifestyle can be a bunch of different things, right? It can be things like food and dancing and dress, entertainment, sports, literature, right? All of that is encompassed in lifestyle. And then the idea that it gets passed on. So grandparents, right? Your grandparents would pass it to your parents and your parents pass it to you and you pass it to your kids. So it's a group of people that have kind of like how social norms is kind of this agreed upon contract, and it's passed on to the next generation. The second thing you need to define is co-culture. You might also want to jot down there in your notes that sometimes it's called subculture. So as we're going through Chapter 4, those terms are used interchangeably, co-culture or subculture. A subculture is a microculture within a larger culture. So it's a smaller group. So it's the same idea as culture, it's just a smaller group. So if you're talking about Americans, you could talk about the subculture of Minnesotans. If you're talking about Minnesotans, you could talk about the subculture of Lakevillians, right? So you can talk about different small groups, and they're not necessarily small, but they're smaller than the bigger parts. So you could say you're a Lakeville South student, or you could say you're part of the junior class or part of the senior class, right? And those would all be examples of subcultures. Okay, so what are examples of your own culture? Well, these are a couple examples of my culture. I consider, myself an American. I have German heritage. I identify with being a Minnesotan. Those would all be examples of my culture. Examples of my subculture or co-cultures. I'm a mom. I'm in a book club. I'm a St. Cloud State alumni. I like playing volleyball. I am a dog mom. I like playing with my dog. I belong to Bethlehem Church. Actually now is called North Cross Church, but that's the church I belong to. So these are all small subcultures or co-cultures that I belong to. And you're going to want to write down at least 2 examples of your culture or your subcultures or co-cultures. Okay. Next, we have the definitions of enculturation and acculturation. Now notice they're similar words. You want to focus on the first half here, N and A. Enculturation is the process by which culture is transmitted from one generation to the next. And I have a little brain trick to help me remember this one. And I think of keeping it in the family, like inculturation. It's enculturation is how it's pronounced, but I think of inculturation, keep it in the family. Okay. So like if your grandma has a recipe and she passes it down to you, that's keeping it in the family, right? So you pass it down, it's transmitted, or you pass it from one generation to the next. Acculturation is a process by which culture is modified or changed through exposure to another culture. So if you think of finger paints, if you mix together blue and yellow, they don't stay blue and yellow, they actually change, right? So same thing with acculturation. And I think of of the prefix a kind of being like asynchronous, would be like different, right? So I think of a being different, is how I can remember that one. But acculturation is when your culture changes because you've been exposed to another one. Now, most oftentimes it's because you pick up and you move and you live in a new spot, or you're experiencing, people around you, culture around you changes you. But sometimes it could be like a foreign exchange student moves next door to you, and you guys start hanging out and you become friends, and you pick up culture through being experienced that way too. So you don't even have to leave Lakeville to find acculturation. The other thing you can think about it is it doesn't have to be that big culture. It could be the subcultures. So if you have never snowboarded, but you start hanging out with snowboarders, you'd probably pick out some of their slang, right? And that would be an example of acculturation. So what are examples of enculturation or acculturation in your life? Here are two examples for me. I would say enculturation is John Deere and acculturation is tea. So I did a study abroad in England, and before I went to England, I hated tea. And the only time I had it was when I was sick and my grandma put lemon in it and tried to make me drink it, and I hated tea. And I got to England, and over in England, everybody drank tea. And it was the first time I tried tea with milk, and sometimes honey, milk and honey, and I loved it. And I still drink tea now, and it's because I was exposed to it in England. So tea is my example of acculturation. Enculturation is my example of John Deere. My family is a John Deere family. All right, so here's a picture of my family, and this is me pregnant with Liam. So Liam hasn't been born yet, but this was the picture my dad used for his Christmas card that year because he got a new combine. Okay, so not only in the Kicker household is John Deere found in the fields, but John Deere is found like on our drinkware and our blankets and, the sweatshirts that we wear. And green is a big deal. And here's a picture of Caleb when he was 1 for his first Christmas. And Grandpa and Grandma gave him this little tractor, and Mom bought him this little John Deere shirt. And there you go. Enculturation. My dad passed on the love of John Deere tractors to me, and I'm passing it on to my son. So that's my example of enculturation. Okay, then the next terms that we're going to do here is ethnocentrism and culture shock. Ethnocentrism is believing that your cultural traditions and assumptions are superior to those of others. Now, it's good to be proud of who you are, and it's good to kind of have knowledge of your heritage and be proud of yourself. But ethnocentrism is not pride. Ethnocentrism is taking it a step farther and saying, I'm better. So my culture is better. I'm always the best. Okay. So you'd say like, what kind of food do I eat on a normal basis? What kind of food do you eat on a normal basis? Gross. Mine is better, right? What kind of music do I listen to? What kind of music do you listen to? Oh, stupid. Mine is better, right? So ethnocentrism is always believing that your culture is better. Culture shock. This is going to be when you have feelings of anxiety, when you enculture a culture that's different from your own. So again, if you pick up and get dropped in a new location, so you're dropped in France and you don't speak French and you're looking around and you can't order off the menu and you can't ask for directions and it's really overwhelming and stressful, that would be culture shock. But you can get culture shock, again, without ever leaving Minnesota. I remember I grew up like in a rural area, and the first time I drove downtown Minneapolis, that was culture shock. Right? Or again, when you're introduced to somebody who comes into your space and they have a different culture, you can have a culture shock then too. Okay. And what are some examples of culture shock? Like I said, it could be anytime you're feeling a little discomfort, stress, uneasy, when you're in a place that that is different. So sometimes when you're experiencing people who speak a different language, or sometimes when you're experiencing different social norms than you're prepared for. Okay, those are all examples of culture shock. And generally, this idea of culture shock has a honeymoon period. So if you would move to a new country or maybe even a new state, you would have at first this little like awesome peak, like, oh, let's check out the new food and the new scenery, and this is all awesome. And then it's like it's hard because it's like you notice the uncomfortable stuff and you miss home and you get homesick. And then finally you adapt, and that culture becomes your culture. Okay, so one last slide here, and then we're done for today. Low context culture and high context culture. Low context culture is when people get information mostly from words. So it's a culture that focuses more on words. And high context culture is where people get more of their information from nonverbals. So this next slide kind of shows you that there is a continuum, and different cultures tend to fall someplace on that continuum. And the culture or the country, if you're looking here by flag, tends to get more of their meaning from a certain thing. Okay. So if you can see, like, we've got, the US is towards the lower context side, but we're not all the way on the end cap. If you take somebody from, all the way on the left and all the way on the right, and you put them in a room to do a business deal together, it might be kind of hard for them, because one of them would be looking at the nonverbal cues and one of them would be looking at words. So somebody says, I really trust you. I want to move forward with this business deal. And they would focus on the words, but the other person would be like, oh, well, you are giving me direct eye contact, and in my culture, that's a sign of disrespect, and I'm going to place more emphasis on the nonverbal than I am the verbal, and therefore I don't trust you, and I think you're actually insulting me, right? So it can get kind of complicated. And that's just one way that we're different. So we're going to do part 2 of chapter 4 later this week, and we'll talk more about how cultures can be different. But for today, you're really thinking about your own culture. What are things that are unique to your own culture? What are some examples of co-culture, culture, enculturation, acculturation? Even how much emphasis do you feel like you put on words or not words, low context, high context culture, and it's thinking about your own culture. All right. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, thanks.